Welcome to Crash Landing. My name's Steve, and every episode I'm going to be guiding an intrepid explorer as they crash land on an alien planet. They have 1 hour to choose the 5 books they couldn't live without on their brave new world.
Warning, ship crash landing. You have 60 minutes to enter the archives and recover significant cultural artifacts. Authorization required. Identify yourself.
I'm Francesca Haig. I'm a novelist and poet, and I am the author of The Fire Sermon, The Map of Bones, and The Forever Ship, which is a post-apocalyptic trilogy published in the UK by Harper Voyager.
Well, thank you for coming on and talking to me about some of your favourite books, which unfortunately, as I said, I'm going to crash land you on this planet. So these are not your favourite books, these are 5 books that you couldn't live without.
That's sort of much of a muchness to me, actually. They're also my faves. They're pleasure faves as well as ones I couldn't do without, I think.
Okay, so tell me about your first choice.
First one would be Fugitive Pieces by Anne Michaels, which is the most astonishing piece of Holocaust literature. And this one I first read when I was about sort of early 20s. And I remember reading the first few pages and just being thunderstruck because she was a well-established poet for years before she wrote this novel. And it's not quite prose poetry, but it's not far off. And she does things with language that seemed at the time to me to be so audacious. And I really just remember thinking, oh, are you allowed to do that? Can you do that with words? And so it was just revelatory for me. And I've never lost that fondness for the novel. It's not perfect. It has flaws, but I wrote my PhD in large part on it, and the fact that I still adore it after spending 3 years studying it, I think speaks very highly of the book.
Absolutely. So is it the structure itself that interested you, or the material, or both?
Well, initially it was the language of the book that drew me in, and because I loved this book so much, I more or less cobbled together a PhD proposal around the book. I was thinking, all right, I love this book. How can I justify studying it for years and writing a PhD? So that was the starting point for my whole PhD. And then because I had written my PhD on that, I ended up in my academic life specializing in historical fiction, particularly Holocaust literature. So the subject matter subsequently became of great interest to me. But at the time, it was just the language. I couldn't believe that she could get away with this astonishing poetic language in what was also a very gripping novel.
And obviously the subject matter is very evocative. There's a lot of books and non-fiction have been written about this, and films and TV shows and many things made around it. So had you read a lot of Holocaust literature before this?
I hadn't much before this. I mean, I have now. Now I have shelves of the stuff. I always worry that anyone who comes to my house will think I'm some kind of ghoul. But because it became my academic specialism, obviously I've read a huge amount now. But no, at the time, I wasn't in any way an expert in the Holocaust or Holocaust representation, Holocaust literature. And I was just drawn into this story. The characters that she creates, and above all the language. And there is something quite structurally interesting as well, because the first half of the book is narrated by Jacob, and then there's the second half of the book, suddenly and quite dislocatingly, you're with another narrator altogether, and bits of the second narrator's story in the second half of the book, Ben's story, we subsequently realise are kind of Jacob's diaries from the first half. So the two pieces exist in this slightly uneasy relationship to one another, where at first you really miss Jacob and you're bereft to suddenly find yourself in the hands of another narrator, and then these links begin to be established, and you see how they fit together, and it's beautifully done.
It sounds remarkable. It's not something that I've read before, but I've read something called Mouse. Have you heard of that?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not a great graphic novel expert or reader, but it's one of the few graphic novels that I have read. I mean, and that's just a masterpiece.
And it's the only one that I know of that's won the Pulitzer Prize. Art Spiegelman won it, and this is obviously the conversations that he had with his father about being a Polish Jew and a Holocaust survivor, and it's an incredibly moving book, despite the fact that it's got that sort of anthropomorphic feel with all of the characters are made into various animals and things. But
but the fascinating thing about mouse is that the metaphor slips, and they deliberately and very self-reflexively show how it is a construct. So every now and again they draw attention to the fact that the Jews being depicted as the mice is nothing but a construct, and you see the masks literally sort of slip, and so it's always drawing attention to its own artifice in a way. I think Mouse and Fugitive Pieces actually have a lot in common, because they're both neither of them are really about first-hand experience of the Holocaust. They're actually about, although Spiegelman's is autobiographical, and Anne Michael's, although she's very reticent and private about her personal history, but I think it's certainly accepted that she is the child of Holocaust survivors. But this is not autobiographical; it's fictionalized. But they're both about the difficulty of expressing a trauma and a horror as great as that, and they're both approaching it from the next generation. So the history of the Holocaust in those stories, in Mouse, he's getting it from his cantankerous and often very difficult father. And in Fugitive Pieces, Jacob escapes when he's very, very young, and his parents are lost. So he's always one step removed from it as well. So I'm interested in the impossibilities of representing trauma, and both of these novels are very, very bold in sort of exploring the limitations of what can be said, and not reaching beyond what they can actually say.
I also like the fact that Spiegelman's father, despite being shown as this great survivor during the war, is now an old and quite racist in his own way. So it wasn't painting a perfect picture of a man as he is now and as he was then. He's become this, as I said, cantankerous and slightly racist guy against black people, and Art can't believe that his father, having gone through all of that, can still be a racist and stuff. And it's just I guess it shows that despite everything that some people go through, humans are just flawed individuals.
That's right, and that they refuse to become neatly sanctified, perfect victims.
Absolutely. Well, I suspect after reading something like that, it definitely leaves an indelible mark on the reader.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone goes for it, because there are those like me who lap up her very poetic language and are happy to sort of let the stream of metaphors wash over me and enjoy it. And there are some who find it unbearably flowery and sort of think, oh, God, what is this, So it's not for everyone, but it is unquestionably for me. And it's one of the 3 novels that I keep above my writing desk. I don't even refer to it very often, because I spent so long studying it. I feel like I know it inwards, but I just like to have it close to me as a kind of talisman.
Yeah, I've got a few of those as well. Okay, so tell me about your second choice.
The second would be Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And this is this very brief and utterly soul-destroying post-apocalyptic novel about a father and son travelling through a destroyed world.
It's quite a new book compared to some of the others. It was published in 2006, I think. Yeah,
it is 2006. I read it only a year or two after it was first published, and it hit me in a way that very few things have, and it stayed with me, and I never tire of rereading it either. It's a book that I taught for years when I was teaching at a university, and those books can very quickly have the joy sucked out of them. You have to reread them every year. You have to take seminar after seminar discussing them with students, and that process can tear them to pieces. But this book just cannot be dimmed. I just adore it. I never recommend it to people to read unless they're feeling fairly robust, because it is so devastatingly bleak. But there's an element of hope just in the relationship between the father and the son. And I've reread this book several times since I had a kid of my own. And of course, those bits have another layer of meaning to me now. And I just adore this book.
So had you always been a fan of post-apocalyptic, or was it just this one that caught your attention in particular?
I think as an adult, I sort of hadn't realised the extent to which, as a kid, I'd read a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff. And now I look back and I'm vaguely horrified at how bleak some of the stuff I read as a young teenager was, because I Children of the Dust and Z is for Zachariah, and Brother in the Land. And I look back now as an adult and think, Christ, that was very dark stuff. And then I wasn't reading much post-apocalyptic stuff as an adult until I wrote these 3 post-apocalyptic books, and then obviously felt I had to do my research. But The Road, I think, tops them all. And again, it tends for me to boil down to the language. And what's so amazing about it is Cormac McCarthy, I've always enjoyed his stuff, but in a lot of his other books, his language is so baroque and wordy, and I'm a reasonably articulate, well-educated person, but I would still regularly have to look up terms that he uses in novels. And I remember stopping halfway through one of his books and counting the words in a sentence because it was just so long and so convoluted and so baroque that I thought, actually, he's just taking the piss at this point. He's gone into the realms of self-parody. So even though I'd really loved his stuff, the language was so much one way. And then he pops out this short, perfect book in which the language is completely the other way, all these incredibly short, stark, brief sentences with very little of that baroque language that you see in his other works. And it's just so astonishing that a writer that I thought had such a distinctive voice could change that voice so dramatically and do it so well. So I love all of his stuff, but this one is the jewel in the crown for me.
It makes you wonder about writing styles as well. I think about my own writing, and I fall into a rhythm and a certain pattern, and then maybe he did the same and wanted to break out and do something so very, very different, and a bit of different muscles to stretch, as we were talking about before.
That's right. I mean, he'd produced a significant volume of fiction, and it would be very easy to feel that this is what you do. And especially, I think, if you become hugely successful, you have a formula perhaps, and it ain't broke. Then the sort of courage that it takes to produce something so radically different. He said in an interview, he doesn't do much in the way of interviews famously, but that this was a book he wrote for his son. So it was written with a different intent, I think, and it's just so stunning. And the thing about the language is the language has been burnt down and left to nothing but bare bones. It's like the landscape that the man and his son are walking through. There's nothing left. There's no flesh on it. It's so stark. So the language that's used to describe this scorched world is itself scorched and broken, and I find that so unbearably moving.
My favourite post-apocalyptic book is one that I came to blind, knowing nothing about, and it's now become one of my favourites that every now and then I have to reread it because it's so unique and so beautiful, and it's from an author that very people really even know about as well. So,
what's that?
It's The Reapers Are the Angels by Alden Bell.
Right, I'm writing that down now.
That's his pen name. His real name is Joshua Gaylord. I think he teaches English in Massachusetts, and the story is about a young girl called Temple traveling across a post-apocalyptic world that's been overrun by zombies, essentially like a zombie apocalypse. But it couldn't be further from something like The Walking Dead than you can imagine, because it's 20 or 30 years on from there, and she's, I think, 15, so she's never known anything else.
Yeah.
And the language there, again, it's not completely stripped down, but it's poetic and it's moving, and she's this young girl trying to find beauty and a purpose in a world that's completely broken and completely messed up, and yet it just moved me in a way I still struggle to explain. And he's done a couple of other books since, and he's got such a remarkable and unique voice that it's definitely one of my kind of go-to recommendations now.
I haven't come across it before. I'm going to order it as soon as we're finished speaking. The other post-apocalyptic book, which narrowly missed out on making my top 5, but which I always fly the flag for when these things are discussed, is Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, which I think is just astonishingly good. And she does, in such a short space, so much of what I was trying to do in 300 and something thousand words in my trilogy. She conjures a whole world, and it's also got these incredibly poetic reflections on Shakespeare, and you catch glimpses of the world both before and after its decimated by this Georgian flu that she imagined, and it's just a stunningly moving and insightful book that I can't recommend enough.
I think it won the Clarke Award as well, didn't it? It
got serious acclaim. I can't remember the specific prizes, but it justifiably did very, very well.
Okay, so tell me about your next choice.
All right, the next one is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is the, again, justifiably acclaimed 1986 novel about the legacy of slavery in America. And this was another book that I studied in my PhD. And again, it never lost its power for me, which I think is testament to the book's incredible impact. And the thing that I love about this book is the tone. Right from the very opening pages, you're sucked into this deeply gothic, utterly sinister world where the main character, Seth, is living and trying to avoid the truth of a traumatic event that happened some years past. And the book itself can't even approach that event. It circles around it structurally, so it takes a long time before the truth of that trauma is finally made clear to us. But we know from the very first words of this book something terrible happened.
It's quite a heavy subject. Again, it's all around slavery after the American Civil War.
I know. I think I'm setting myself up for a really miserable time on this planet that I'm crash landing on for the purposes of this podcast. But these are the books that have stuck with me. And even though it's obviously historical subject matter, it's never felt more urgent, because the more we see coming out of America and elsewhere, the more we see that any illusions of us occupying a post-racial society are only illusions, and that this stuff is urgent and pressing. This is a history that's not been satisfactorily acknowledged or meaningfully atoned for, and so even though it's a historical novel, it feels so pressing, and I never get tired of reading it and of recommending it to people.
It's definitely timely, I would say, as you said, given the current climate in America. So the secondary theme, I did some research on it, said was to do with mother-daughter relationships in its book.
Yeah, and I think the kind of relationships that always interest me are those that are ambiguous and conflicted. So the relationship between Seth and the ghost of her murdered daughter is one of intense love and need, but also completely destructive codependence that threatens to destroy them both. So it's, I always think, I don't think anything has summed this up better than a line in a kid's book. Since I had my son a few years ago, I'm always reading children's books, and a lot of them are much darker than I remembered, and many of them are also hugely insightful and really ring true. And there's a line in the very famous Where the Wild Things Are that says, I'll eat you up, I love you so. And that sense of love as a devouring force, I think, is very present in Beloved. And they're the kind of relationships that interest me, not ones where people just hate each other or just love each other, but those that are much more complex and sometimes more twisted than that.
Yeah, I think, obviously I write fantasy, and I think a long time it moved away from the idea of white hats and black hats, and it moved into much more grey territory. So you have people who are not necessarily the hero or the villain. They're just very layered and very grey, trying to do the best they can in usually remarkable and difficult circumstances.
Absolutely, and that's something that Toni Morrison evokes so well. And the other thing, you mentioned fantasy, that's so amazing about this book is that it is a fantasy novel. It's about a ghost. It's a ghost story, but it's also saying urgent things about very real historical events. So it combines the two in a breathtaking way that I don't think I've seen done or pulled off in that many other books, where you believe absolutely in the fantastical elements, but they never detract from the very real and urgent real life aspects of the book.
It always amazes me that I think back to my time at school when I was we were reading Shakespeare and Dickens and Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and for fun I would go and read some fantasy. And now looking back, I can see all the fantastical stuff in all of these bits of work, and yet fantasy was much derided at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, the amazing thing about this is that two of the novels, the three novels that we've talked about so far, could be described as genre novels. The Road is post-apocalyptic. Beloved is a fantasy, a ghost story. But, of course, the minute something receives a certain amount of critical acclaim, it is elevated from the pits of genre in terms of the cliches of genre snobbery and becomes that mystical and elusive thing, a literary novel. So, I could bang on for hours about the nebulousness and arbitrariness of genre categories, but I don't think it takes anything from Beloved to describe it as a ghost story.
No, it sounds really good.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about your next one.
So the last novel on my list is We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which is a bit older than the other books I've chosen so far. It was early 60s, Shirley Jackson, and it's this, again, a very gothic mystery, I suppose, though it's much more about character than about sort of what happened, in which a very sinister young woman called Mary Cat and her sister Constance are living in this rather decrepit house on the outskirts of a village, and it quickly becomes clear that the rest of their family was poisoned, all except them, and their Uncle Julian died. So there is this question of sort of whodunit, and it's accepted that Constance was the one who was tried and, although acquitted, thought to be guilty. But the thing about this book that just kicks you in the guts, and I only read it really recently, I sort of feel a great regret that I only discovered it a couple of years ago, because I've been madly recommending it to everyone since then, and I wish I'd had years more to enjoy reading and rereading it. It's the narrative voice. It is a virtuoso act of narrative voice, the voice of Mary Cat, this young woman who we empathise with and feel for, but also find truly quite frightening, with her sort of homemade magic and her strange possessiveness, and her secrets, is just astonishingly conjured, and I don't think I've read a better evocation of a narrative voice, particularly of a young person, which is really hard to do without being twee or unconvincing, but Shirley Jackson just nails it, and it's astonishing.
I read that it's based, some of it's loosely on her own experiences in sort of small-mindedness in New England, where she moved to a new area and encountered a lot of problems with the locals.
Yeah, and there's a scene in this which takes you right back to kind of villagers coming with flaming torches for Beauty and the Beast or Frankenstein. I mean, this is quite an ancient story, but it's made very fresh. And the funny thing about this is that I always recommend that people read it in a sort of a double act with the similarly named I Capture the Castle, which is like the sunny version of a similar story. So that's Dodie Smith, of 101 Dalmatians fame, and it's completely different in tone, but it's odd family focusing on the sisters living in a decrepit castle-like house with astonishing narrative voice. So even though that is a kind of light romantic comedy, and Shirley Jackson's version is this very, very bleak gothic mystery, the two are actually a sort of perfect counterpoint to each other, and they make the most. I don't think there's any intentional link between them, but they make such a perfect pair.
Does this book feature or hint at any supernatural elements?
Mary Cat practices a kind of imagined homemade magic, but I don't think there's any. I don't think the novel sort of posits that holds any sway. I think the horror at the heart of this novel is a very, very tangible, very human horror. But certainly the vibe of the book is very gothic and feels supernatural, even though there aren't any particular things that you can pin down that are actually sort of shown to be real in terms of magic.
The reason I asked is that I know a number of horror writers have mentioned of saying that it's been a particular inspiration to them, in particular people like Anne Rice or Clive Barker, and I think even Stephen King said it was something that he would refer to from time to time.
Yeah, and the funny thing is it's not itself really a supernatural book. I think that Mary Cat's magic is seen to be part of her own delusion. I suspect a lot of horror writers might come to it because Shirley Jackson's other work, some of it is more straight horror. I think she wrote The Haunting of Hill House and so on, so I can see why people who enjoyed that might find themselves reading We've Always Lived in the Castle and then perhaps be slightly surprised that it's not actually fantastical or a horror book, but in terms of gothic horror tone, I don't think it can be topped, even though you can't put your finger on exactly anything supernatural in it. The tone is just unmatched in terms of the creepy gothic feel of it.
It sounds quite disturbing.
It's very disturbing, but in the very best way.
There were no comedy books on your list.
I know. I also really, really love P.G. Wodehouse, would you believe? I have, almost his entire collected works, but he doesn't stay with me and lodge in my heart the way these ones do, so I'm destined for a very grouchy time on this planet.
Well, there's obviously something in this and all the other ones that speaks to you on a level beyond just the surface story.
Yeah, and there are elements of hope in all of them, if not in the narrative, then in the connection between characters. And actually, my final choice is much more positive, in fact, very much more so, though it's not funny.
Okay, so tell us about your last choice.
So I was being a bit sneaky here because I've gone for New and Selected Poems by Mary Oliver, which is 2 volumes. So I've kind of sneaked a 6th book under the radar there. I hope I can get away with that. So Mary Oliver's a really funny one. She's acclaimed in many ways. She's won the Pulitzer, among other things, and she's America's best-selling poet. But she's not traditionally been taken very seriously by critics, partly perhaps because of her popularity. And I hadn't read very much of her. And then last year, a good friend died, and not unusually, one of the poems that was read at the memorial service was her famous poem, The Summer Day, and the final lines there, which get quoted and, pinned on Pinterest and circulated as inspirational porn on Instagram. But this line, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And that's a very famous and iconic line, but it sounds a bit didactic and preachy, and most of Mary Oliver isn't like that. So after the funeral, I was kind of moved to order the collected works and throw myself into reading it. And I've just found her astoundingly comforting, but not in a pappy porridge and macaroni cheese kind of bland stodge comfort, but in the sense of actually exhilarating and full of joy and wonder. She's very different from the poetry that I write and most of the poetry that I've tended to read, because until her later poems, she's not really interested in people, which is quite unusual for my preferences in poetry, at least. And she writes about the natural world. The sort of classic format is, Mary Oliver goes wandering somewhere, sees some animal or landscape, does a bit of pondering, has a small epiphany about nature. And that sounds quite formulaic, and I think it can be at times. You can read one of her poems and think, okay, that's unmistakably a Mary Oliver poem, but they're perfectly executed. And the things that she says I find incredibly moving and insightful. And she pays attention to the world in a way that I find urgent and inspiring. There's a quote that I've got pinned above my desk, which is it's a mediated quote because it's an Australian writer, Charlotte Wood, and she says, as Iris Murdoch said, paying attention is a moral act. And this idea of attentiveness as something that's a responsibility for authors and that allows us to gain insights and to make ethical choices, and that matters, I suppose. The idea that attentiveness to the world matters is really inspiring and moving to me. And one of my favourite poems by Mary Oliver is called The Summer Day, and it's the one that I quoted the final famous lines of. But the opening of it I find more moving, actually, than those iconic final lines. She says, "I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention." And it's this paying attention to the world, and particularly the natural world, that I find just unspeakably moving in her poems. And particularly in the very difficult few months after my friend's sudden and very premature death, I found that these poems really gave me something I couldn't get from anywhere else.
Yeah, I think nature's filled with so much even if you're not really paying attention, you can see there's so much beauty everywhere if you just focus on it for a moment and forget the people and the other things around you. And the idea of going for a walk every day, seeing something wondrous and writing a poem sounds amazing to me.
Although you talk about the beauty of nature, and in some ways Mary Oliver is one of the things that's distinctive about her is that she's not sentimental about nature, and often what she's talking about is, a dead fox that her dog brings her. It's quite unflinching in its acknowledgement and attentiveness to the realities of what nature is, but it's finding the beauty despite the ugliness, I think, that's even more moving.
And I think we all have a responsibility that to nature that is now becoming more apparent with every passing year, with what we do to the planet and how we treat it and how we recycle and everything. All these things are becoming more and more urgent, and people are focusing on it more because they have to, because the alternative is it goes away forever and never comes back.
Absolutely. And of course, for the purposes of this podcast, if I was being launched away from the earth, I can't think of a better way to remember and pay tribute to the lost earth than through the poems of Mary Oliver.
I grew up by the sea, and now I live far inland, but I still dream about the sea, and I still think about the sea. That's something that's always been there, and for it not to be there suddenly is quite difficult to describe. But her poems sound the sort of thing that I would definitely like to read. I'm not really one for poetry. It's just never something that I got into. They didn't really teach it at school, and what they did was the very formulaic stuff that they trot out, and you just go through it line by line, studying it, breaking it down, and you never actually soak into it.
That's the perfect way to absolutely crush any nascent love of poetry in a student.
Yeah.
I recommend her heartily, partly because if you're not someone who normally reads much poetry, she's very accessible. There's nothing cryptic or tricksy or pretentious about her poems. So, you can't go wrong. I recommend volume 1 of New and Selected Poems as the ideal starting place.
So tell me a little about your poetry. What sort of stuff do you normally write then that's so different, you said?
My poetry, and to be honest, I feel at the moment I'm a bit of a lapsed poet, though I've had a bit of a resurgence in the last year. I initially thought I would be a poet rather than a novelist, and so I had a collection of poems published way back in 2006, I think, back in Australia, and it's now long out of print. But it was sort of slightly confessional, very lyrical, very landscape influenced, though the focus was more on people. And like you, I grew up by the sea. I grew up in Tasmania, and so that island mentality and the sense of the landscape was very pervasive in the poems. But then I got bored with what I was writing. I felt like I was writing a kind of poor man's Sylvia Plath confessional lyrical stuff, and I wanted to do something different. It's taken me a long time to try to find a voice that takes a risk, because I felt like I could keep writing that kind of thing, and I'd been doing it relatively successfully for years, and I was pretty good at it, and I didn't feel I was taking any risks anymore. So I stepped away from poetry for a long time, and that worked out surprisingly well, because I wrote these novels. But I'm really feeling that hunger now to go back to poetry, which has always been my first love, and to see if I can't try to be the poor man's something else. I think I said sort of jokingly that the poems I've been writing more recently are more like the poor man's Ted Hughes than the poor man's Sylvia Plath. And obviously I'm being slightly glib there, and don't think they're horribly derivative, or I wouldn't be writing them. But I think there's a greater rawness and a shift away from the personal in them now, which feels new to me. And I'm hoping that when I finish the book I'm currently writing, that I'll have a good chance to really throw myself back into poems for a while.
Well, having heard what your 5 books are and having read your novels, I can definitely see some of the influences there on things like The Map of Bones and...
Oh, definitely. I mean, you can take the girl out of poetry, etc. I spew lyrical despite my best efforts. And that's what's so funny about the fact that I love The Road and Fugitive Pieces. If they're my kind of top 2 all-time books, they couldn't be more different, because one is like poetry on crack, super, super lyrical to the point that some people hate it. And the other one is stark, bleak, short sentences. And the fact that those two have become the sort of lodestones of my writing life is slightly confusing.
It's funny what we get attached to, I think, as time goes on. I've tried to go back and read other books from my sort of teens and early 20s that I was so passionate about at the time, and now they just don't have the same, most of them don't have the same emotional weight or the same resonance that they used to.
Yeah, and you never read the same book twice, of course, because you're never the same person when you revisit one. But these ones, in my various manifestations over the years, have resonated differently with me every time.
Mm. Well, yeah, that's the mark, I guess, of a book, of a really important book to you as an individual, if it's something that you can revisit in several different eras and find new things and new love for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without having it being destroyed by studying it to death line by line.
That's right.
Which has stopped me reading Shakespeare for many years, thanks to my high school teacher.
That breaks my heart.
Well, we studied them so much to death that it was horrendous, that it just soured me for a long time. But yeah, I wish we'd read more poetry. I wish we'd done a lot of different things, but, you know.
Well, it's never too late to get on the poetry bandwagon, Steve.
Absolutely. It's not something I think I would ever write just because of how my brain works, but I'd definitely like to read a little bit more. So I'll definitely try and check out the first volume by Mary Oliver.
All right, and if you like it, email me and I can send you further poetry suggestions. I can set you up a starter's poetry course.
Okay. So unfortunately, I now have to crash land you on this alien planet, but you get to choose a kind of planet. So what sort of planet would you like to be living on?
Well, I was taking the piss slightly in my choice because I've chosen something a bit. I'm thinking a kind of Maldives overwater villa. Thank you very much. So I suppose that's probably overreaching, but something coastal. And we get back to my Tasmanian upbringing here, that sense that the sea, everything will always be a bit better if one can see the sea. So if you can put me somewhere where there's some salt water and a bit of coast, and I'll fend for myself there.
How do you think you'd cope, living on your own? Are you someone who's quite hands-on and good with DIY?
I'm great at DIY. I once shared an office with a professor at university who complained because I brought in my cordless drill and put some shelves up. He famously said, Shakespeare never had to put up with this kind of ruckus. And I thought it was so perfectly peaceful in Elizabethan England. So, no, I am quite hands-on, and I like running, and I used to rock climb, but I'm also pretty lazy. So I wouldn't like my chances of long-time survival, but I'll have a good time for as long as I last, at least with these books.
Well, thank you for sharing your choices, and thank you for joining me here.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Steve.
My thanks to Francesca Haig for joining me for this episode. If you'd like to find out more about her novels, The Fire Sermon, The Map of Bones and The Forever Ship, there's more information on her website, which is francescahaig.com. Thanks for listening, and if you'd like to support this podcast and all of the other podcasts on the Geek Syndicate network, you can visit patreon.com/Geek Syndicate.